I can't do this anymore, abuela. My friends are coming to the lobby. They can't see me here with ... you. The words spoken in a hushed, irritated whisper by my granddaughter, Isabella, were colder than the 4-needle in my arm. They twisted like a blade of ice in my heart, already weakened by the poison meant to be my cure. I stared at the beige, sterile wall of the chemo ward, at the rhythmic drip of the bag beside me, and I thought, for this, I crossed a border with nothing but my name. For this, I scrubbed floors on my knees until they bled, so my son, her father, could wear a suit and tie. For this, I poured every last drop of my life, my culture, my love, into a family that now sees me as a stain on their perfect, Americanist-immolated lives. The irony was so bitter, it burned more than the nausea climbing up my throat. I had given them a future, and in return, they had given me a death sentence of shame. The steady, monotonous beep of the infusion pump next to me suddenly flatlined into a high-pitched, continuous scream. A nurse shouted something from down the hall. Another machine began to blare its own alarm. In that single, chaotic moment, the world seemed to freeze. I looked at Isabella's face, pale and wide-eyed, not with concern for me, but with the sheer horror of being the center of unwanted attention. She looked like a cornered animal. In her eyes, I wasn't her grandmother fighting for her life. I was just a loud, embarrassing immigrant problem that had suddenly malfunctioned in public. The symphony of alarms was the soundtrack to my ultimate humiliation, a public broadcast of my disposability. How did I become so small in their eyes? When did the hands that rocked her cradle, that cooked the meals that made her strong, that held a cool cloth to her fevered head, become something to be ashamed of? When did my accent, the same accent that whispered stories of our homeland into her ear as a child, become a source of disgrace? Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of my sickness. Not a fear of the cancer that was eating me from the inside out, but a fear that I had already died a long time ago and simply hadn't noticed. My mind, hazy from the chemo drugs and the shock, drifted back. Back to a time when my name was not just abuela, when my hands were not just for cleaning and cooking, but for commanding life from the earth itself. My memory took me to the small, sun-drenched kitchen of our first apartment in this country. It smelled of bleach and the faint, sweet scent of the tortillas I would make from scratch because the ones from the store tasted like paper. My son Carlos was a boy then, and he'd watch me, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and hunger. "Mama, how do you make them so perfect?" Eddie asked, and I'd laugh, dusting his nose with flour. Years later, I stood in the sprawling, stainless steel kitchen of his expensive home. A home my savings had helped secure the down payment for. I watched my daughter-in-law Susan unbox a ridiculously priced gourmet meal kit. When I offered to make my homemade arroz con palo for Isabella's birthday, Susan had smiled that tight, polite smile of hers. "Oh, Alina, that's sweet, but we want her to have, a normal American party, not too ethnic." That was the first prick of the needle. Left alone in the sterile room, surrounded by the deafening silence that followed the chaos of the alarms, I hit the bottom. The nurse had stabilized the machine, her face a mask of professional pity. But it wasn't the broken machine or the cold dread of the cancer that shattered me. It was the image of Isabella's back as she fled, not even a glance over her shoulder. It was the realization that my life's great sacrifice had produced nothing but contempt. I felt a hollowness so profound it echoed in my bones. I had erased myself for them, becoming a quiet, simple, agreeable old woman. And now, that empty vessel was all that was left, a shell to be discarded. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I wept, silent tears tracking paths through the wrinkles on my face, not for the life I was losing to disease, but for the life I had already lost to shame. The tears were not the hot, angry tears of my youth. They were cold, a slow seep of regret. I had traded the rich, dark soil of my father's land for this sterile linoleum. I had traded the language of poetry and lullabies for a broken, hesitant English that made me sound simple. For what? For a son who saw me as a responsibility and a granddaughter who saw me as an embarrassment. The finality of it was a stone in my gut. This was the end of the story. I had lived for them, and it was a story of erasure. I looked down at my hands, resting on the pale green blanket. These gnarled, veiny things. Isabella saw them as old woman's hands, good for nothing. But I remembered when they were strong. I could feel the fainted weight of the *metod*, the smooth, solid volcanic stone I used to grind the corn for our tortillas. The rhythmic, circular motion was a prayer, a connection to generations of women whose hands had done the same work. My mother taught me, her own hands guiding mine, her voice a soft murmur about the soul of the maize. You must put your own spirit into it, *MIJA*, she'd say. Otherwise, it's just food. I could almost smell the earthy scent of the nixtamal, the feel of the cool, wet dough beneath my palms. I made those tortillas for Carlos every single day. He would sit at the small formica table in that cramped kitchen, his school books open, and watch me. His eyes weren't just hungry, they were full of a profound, simple love. No one makes them like you, Mama, he'd say, his mouth full, and that was all the thanks I ever needed. It was a covenant, unspoken but absolute, my labor for his love. I built his strength, tortilla by tortilla, so he could succeed in this new world. I thought I was building a legacy that would honor our heritage. But the legacy had rotted from the inside. The memory of Susan's words, not to ethnic, was a shard of glass in my heart. My food, the very essence of my love and my history, was now something to be sanitized, avoided. And Isabella, her words, were the final twist of the knife. It makes you sound like a maid. She didn't know that her own abuela had cleaned the houses of wealthy women for years to help with the down payment on that very house she lived in. She didn't know that my hands, which she found so embarrassing, had scrubbed their floors and wiped their counters so that hers could hold a smartphone without a callus. The shame wasn't mine to bear. I had handed it to them, a cursed inheritance they now wore like a cheap perfume, masking the scent of their own ingratitude. A new feeling began to stir in the hollow space, a small, hot coal igniting in the ashes of my grief. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a stark, unforgiving clarity. This illness, this cancer, they saw it as an ending, a messy, inconvenient conclusion to the story of Abuela. But what if it was a beginning? The poison they were pumping into my veins was not the first poison I had endured. I had survived the slow, psychic poison of their disdain. This chemical one was just more honest. The nurse came in to check my vitals, her touch efficient and impersonal. "How are we feeling?" she asked, the collective pronoun a lie. I did not answer. I just watched her. And for the first time, I saw not a caretaker, but a functionary in the machinery of this cold, white world. When she left, I looked at the forepole, the bag of clear liquid dripping into my arm. My life had been a series of infusions. I had infused my strength into my son, my culture into my granddaughter, my savings into their future. And it had all been rejected. My body was now rejecting their cure. A resolve, hard and sharp as a flint, settled within me. If I was to be a vessel, I would no longer be an empty one. I would not be filled with their chemo, their pity, their shame. The vessel would break. I would let everything I had buried for decades come flooding out. The woman who commanded life from the earth, who spoke the language of the sun and the soil, was not dead. She had just been sleeping. I closed my eyes, and this time, I didn't drift back to memories of their rejection. I went further back, to the *Milpa*, the cornfield behind my childhood home. I felt the sun on my neck, the sting of sweat in my eyes, the incredible, vibrant *life* pushing up from the ground beneath my feet. That was my truth. Not this sterile room, not this polite contempt. I opened my eyes. The silence was no longer deafening, it was anticipatory. The weight on my chest had not lessened, but I had decided to carry it differently. It was no longer the weight of their burden. It was the weight of my own history, my own strength. Let the cancer come. Let the treatments fail. The woman who was dying was the one they had created. The one I was about to resurrect had no name they would recognize, and she was not going gently into their good night. My fingers, now thin and mapped with blue veins, traced the carved floral pattern on the lid. It was the only beautiful thing I had brought with me, this box my father had made for my mother. It smelled of cedar and dust, a scent from another world. I was supposed to be packing my nightgowns, my sensible slippers, the meager possessions of a dying woman being moved to a place where death was a managed, sanitized process. But my hands, acting on a will older than my own, had pulled the box from the back of the closet. The brass clasp was stiff, protesting with a tiny shriek. Inside, layered like geological strata, were the artifacts of my burial. A sepia-toned photograph of my parents, their faces stern with the effort of holding still for the camera. My university diploma rolled and tied with a faded ribbon. And beneath it all, lying flat and heavy, the journal. The leather was soft, supple from years of use, its dark brown faded to a pale tan at the edges. I opened it. The scent that rose was not of dust, but of old ink and something else, something green and vital, the ghost of pressed leaves and flowers. My breath hitched. I had expected the looping, sentimental script of a young woman, perhaps poems or pressed flowers. I was not prepared for the stark, elegant precision of my own hand, a script I had all but forgotten. Page after page was a symphony of intellect, a language I had sworn to forget. Complex chemical structures of alkaloids and terpenes spider-webbed across the paper, detailed, cross-hatched diagrams of plant cells. The chloroplasts and mitochondria rendered with an artist's care and a scientist's accuracy. Formulas, dense with symbols and subscripts, filled the margins. This wasn't a diary, it was a laboratory, captured in ink and paper. Asterisk Phase 1 trials show a 72% reduction in tumor size in marine models. Compound appears to selectively target neoplastic cells, leaving healthy tissue largely unaffected. Synergistic effect with traditional preparation methods, heating with clay pot. Specific water source suggests catalytic properties in local minerals. Asterisk, the words were mine. But they felt like they had been written by a brilliant stranger. Dr. Alina Morales, the name echoed in the hollow of my chest, a title that had been stripped from me as effectively as my accent. Before I was a maid, cleaning the houses of women who spoke to me as if I were simple. Before I was a cook, folding the flavors of my homeland into meals my granddaughter would later dismiss as weird. Before I was a silent immigrant, a functionary in the machinery of this cold, white world, I had been a biochemist and ethnobotanist, a leading researcher in my country. I ran a lab. I had a mind that people once respected, a mind that could hold the universe of a single cell and the vast, intricate knowledge of my ancestors in the same thought. And there, on the last written page, was my life's most ambitious, unfinished project. Asterisk Cattleya tharsis. Asterisk. The ghost orchid. It grew only in a single, sacred valley in the high mountains, a place where the mist clung to the trees like a shroud. The local healers, the Curanderis asterisk, used a preparation of its roots in a poultice for strange growths and swellings. They called it the bone knitter, but it was more than that. My initial research, crude by today's standards, but revolutionary then, suggested its compounds didn't just poison cancerous cells, they seemed to reprogram them, triggering apoptosis while simultaneously bolstering the immune response. It was a two-pronged attack, elegant and brutal. I had been so close. I had isolated 3 novel compounds and was on the verge of synthesizing the most promising one when the world fell apart. The political unrest, the threats, the desperate one-way flight north with my young son, clutching his hand and a single suitcase. In this new country, a woman with my face and my accent couldn't be Dr. Morales. That woman was a threat, an inconvenience, so I buried her. I buried her under layers of servitude and silence, and I became someone else. I let them believe I was uneducated, Simple, a pair of hard-working hands and a strong back. A dry, bitter laugh escaped my lips, a sound like rustling leaves. They had brought me their best medicine, their gleaming IV poles and bags of clear, chemical poison. They were so proud of it. And all the while, the cure they were desperate to find had been sleeping in a wooden box at the back of my closet, wrapped in the shroud of my own shame. The resolve that had settled in the hospital, hard and sharp as flint, now ignited. This was not a relic. It was a weapon. The woman who was dying was the one they had created, the passive, compliant patient. The woman I was resurrecting was Dr. Alina Morales. I looked at the half-packed suitcase on the bed, filled with the soft, shapeless clothes of an invalid. With a sweep of my arm, I pushed it onto the floor. The thud was satisfying. I reached for my purse instead, pulling out the sleek, expensive smartphone my son had bought me, the one I barely knew how to use beyond answering his calls. My hands trembled, but not from weakness. From a long dormant energy now coursing back to life. I opened the internet browser. My English was faltering for everyday things, but the language of science was a native tongue I had never truly lost. My fingers, clumsy at first, then with increasing surety, typed into the search bar, *Cattleya on Modiny. Recent studies, the world had forgotten. My research had died with my exile. A fierce, possessive smile touched my lips. Good. They wanted to fill my body with their chemicals. They wanted me to go gently into their good night. But I would not. The vessel was breaking, and it would not be filled with their chemo, their pity, or their shame. It would be filled with the ghost of an orchid and the fury of a woman who had been sleeping for 30 years. I picked up a pen from the nightstand. It felt more natural in my hand than a spoon ever had. I turned to a fresh page in the journal, the blank paper, an uncharted territory more familiar to me than this room. Project, Resurrection. I wrote. The ink, dark and decisive, was a declaration of war. Holding that journal, I felt not the frailty of a cancer patient, but the intellectual fire I thought had been extinguished decades ago. The tears of self-pity turned to a slow-burning determination. They had underestimated me. They had dismissed my knowledge as village superstitions. They saw a simple old woman, not a scientist. In that moment, I made a decision. I would not fade away quietly in a hospice. I would fight. Not just the cancer, but the humiliation. My reclamation would not be loud or emotional. It would be methodical. I would use the mind they had forgotten I possessed to save my own life. The first order of business was reconnaissance. I needed to know the enemy's terrain. My son David, with his gentle eyes and placating tone, was the warden of my cage. I had to learn his schedule, his patterns of surveillance. For 3 days, I played my part perfectly. I shuffled when I walked, let my hand tremble as I lifted a cup of tea, and nodded vacantly at his updates about the hospice's wonderful palliative care team. I was the ghost he expected. All while my mind was a hive, buzzing with plans. I noted he called every day at 5:15 p.m., his voice tight, with a concern that felt more like a leash than a lifeline. The calls lasted precisely 12 to 15 minutes. That was my window, a small, clear pocket of time when his attention was fully engaged. And I was presumed to be passively listening, a background noise to his guilt. On the 4th day, when the phone rang at its appointed time, I put it on speaker and set it down, murmuring vague assurances. Then, I moved. My body, which had felt like a sack of bones, now felt like a tool. I went to the small desk in the corner of my room, a piece of furniture I had ignored for years. The top drawer was stuck. I yanked it, a surge of that dormant energy, making my muscles sing with the effort. It gave way with a splintering crack. Inside, beneath a pile of old birthday cards and expired warranties, was a relic. My old leather-bound address book. The leather was cracked, the gilded edges tarnished, but as I brushed my fingers over it, a map of my former life flickered in my mind's eye. Colleagues, assistants, field contacts, the entire network that had been severed. I flipped through the brittle pages, names and numbers blurring. So many were surely dead, retired, or lost to time. But then I found it: Alejandro Ruiz, head gardener, Jardín Botánico Las Palmas. Alejandro, a young, passionate botanist who had been my most dedicated assistant, who had looked at me, not with condescension, but with something akin to awe. He would be in his late 50s now. If anyone had stayed true, it would be him. My heart was a frantic bird against my ribs. I could hear David's voice droning from the speakerphone. Double quotes, ... and they have art therapy. Mom, you used to love drawing. I had been mapping the synergistic properties of riparian flora, and he thought I'd find solace in fixing. I copied Alejandro's number onto a fresh page in my journal, my script, for the first time in years, clear and sharp. Then, I closed the address book and shoved it back into its tomb just as David was saying his goodbyes. The phone call was the true gauntlet. It took me 2 more days to muster the courage. I waited for the 5:15 p.m. call, my plan solidified. As soon as David started speaking, I picked up the landline receiver in the hallway, my back to my bedroom door. David, I interrupted, my voice a carefully calibrated whisper of distress. The television? It's making a terrible noise. A high-pitched sound. I can't make it stop. The moment the line went dead, I snatched the receiver up again and dialed Alejandro's number, my fingers moving with a speed that felt like a rebirth. The international ringtone was a strange, pulsing siren. 1 ring. 2. I could hear David's cell phone ringing my line, trying to call me back. 3 hings. Buen. Asterisk, a man's voice answered, deep and weathered by the sun. The sound of that single word, the familiar cadence of my native Spanish, was a physical blow. For a second, I couldn't speak. Asterisk, hola. Asterisk, he said again, impatient. Alejandro, I said, my voice shedding its feigned weakness, becoming the firm, clear tone of Dr. Elena Morales. This is Elena Morales. Morales, he finally whispered, the name a sacred relic. They said you were gone, ill. The records after you left, the university purged the non-native, the unverified collections. They called it a streamlining. I could hear the disgust in his voice. But they did not get everything. The asterisk, Catlia asterisk. It was so beautiful. I could not let them destroy it. I took the last viable seed pods. I have been keeping it a secret. In my private collection, the ghost was not just a memory. It had a physical form, sleeping in a garden far away. Alejandro, listen to me carefully, I said, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I am sending you a list. The original formula. I need you to prepare it. Exactly as we did before. Do you understand? I walked back into my room, my posture straight, and picked up my smartphone as David's call went to voicemail. The high-pitched noise from the television had, of course, been a fiction. But the silence in the room now was different. It was the quiet of a laboratory before a great experiment begins, humming with potential. I opened my journal to the page titled Asterisk Project. Resurrection Asterisk. Beneath it, I began to write the first ingredients of my salvation. The ink flowing as smoothly as a long-dammed river finally breaking free. The war had begun, and I had just secured my first and most crucial ally. The cancellation of the hospice was the first true incision. A clean cut severing me from the world of the dying and placing me squarely back in the land of the living, albeit a life of my own peculiar design. Telling Carlos the lie was easier than I'd anticipated. The words, promising results, felt like stones in my mouth, but his sigh of relief on the phone was a balm to my guilt. He wanted so desperately to believe in a miracle, and I was simply providing the framework for one he couldn't yet comprehend. His faith was the first ingredient in my new formula, a passive, unwitting component. My savings, a meager nest egg I'd once imagined would see me into a peaceful, quiet end, now became the war chest for my rebellion. The transformation of my small bathroom was a methodical, almost sacred process. Out went the scented candles and fluffy towels. In came stainless steel instrument trays, a second-hand laminar flow hood I'd purchased from a shuttered dental lab, and gallons of industrial-grade disinfectant. The mirror, which had once reflected only my own withering face, now reflected the gleaming glassware of a rudimentary laboratory. The air no longer smelled of soap, but of ethanol and the sharp, clean scent of ozone from the purifier. It was my sanctuary, my command center. The real work, however, began in the digital world. The university library's online portal became my gateway, my rabbit hole back into the life I had forsaken. Decades of research, papers on cellular regeneration, xenobotany, and obscure phytochemical reactions flashed across my screen. It was like flexing a phantom limb and feeling it respond with shocking, vigorous strength. The fog of illness, the dull ache that had been my constant companion, began to recede not as a symptom of remission, but as a side effect of intense, focused purpose. My mind, my old, sharp, and ruthless mind, was snapping back into focus, voraciously consuming the science I had left behind. I was no longer Dr. Eva Rostova, the retired botanist dying in her apartment. I was the Doctora, the architect of impossible things. But the mind and the machine were nothing without the materia prima. The asterisk, Cattleya tharsis asterisk. It was the keystone, the catalyst, the living poem from another world that held the secret melody of cellular instruction. My inquiries, sent from a shadowy, anonymous email account, were exercises in precise academic cryptography. I was not a dying woman seeking a cure. I was a private researcher with specific botanical interests, inquiring about sourcing possibilities for a closed-system study. I used the old language, the coded lexicon of grant proposals and peer reviews, to feel out the edges of the underground botanical trade. The responses were a study in the economics of rarity. One dealer from Singapore quoted a price for a single pseudobulb that would have bankrupted me twice over. His email dripping with a condescending assurance that I was merely another wealthy hobbyist chasing a myth. Another, from a dubious outfit in Eastern Europe, promised viable specimens with attached photos, so blatantly doctored I almost laughed. The real trail, the one I knew in my bones, was the only one that mattered. Was the one leading back to the Valle de la Luna itself. But that was a path I was not yet ready to walk, a ghost I was not yet prepared to face on its own terrain. Alejandro had the seeds. The legacy? My task was to build the vessel, to recreate the conditions for a miracle. So, I haunted. I became a specter in the academic machine. Using my forgotten credentials to access faculty-only databases, cross-referencing soil composition analyses from the Atacama with hydroponic nutrient solutions, I reached out to former colleagues with vague, nostalgic messages, subtly steering conversations toward their current work on extremophile adaptations, gleaning fragments of useful data from their unsuspecting chatter. I was a ghost. Yes, but I was a ghost with a scalpel, dissecting the world for the pieces I needed. Late one night, the silence of my apartment was broken only by the hum of the server in the hall closet and the soft click of my keyboard. An email alert popped up. It was from a server I didn't recognize, the address a string of numbers. The subject line was blank. The body contained only a single, hyperlinked word. *inquire*. My hand, which had been trembling with a familiar, weary weakness just weeks ago, hovered over the mouse, steady as a rock. This was it, the first real bite. The shadows of the scientific world were beginning to notice the new predator in their midst. I clicked the link, and a new window opened, filled with the dense, taxonomic text of a plant specimen sheet. It wasn't the Cattleya asterisk, but it was a cousin, another high-altitude orchid from a similarly brutal environment. It was a test. A calling card from the underworld of botany I was trying to penetrate. A slow smile spread across my face. The war had begun, and the enemy's outposts were now in view. I began to type my reply, my fingers flying across the keys, each tap a quiet drumbeat marching me toward my resurrection. The city beyond my window was a smear of gray indifference, a world that had written me off as a footnote. But inside Mr. Way's apothecary, the air was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 forests. A fragrant, living dust that settled on my shoulders like a blessing. The scent of ginseng, dried chrysanthemum, and something unnameably sharp filled my lungs, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was breathing something that mattered. Mr. Way moved behind his counter, a small, precise man whose hands, gnarled like ancient roots, handled delicate porcelain jars with a surgeon's care. He hadn't spoken beyond a quiet greeting, his eyes doing all the questioning. When I laid my journal on the worn wood, opening it to the page where I had painstakingly transcribed the orchid's hypothetical molecular structure, a map of its ghost, his stillness deepened. He didn't frown in scientific bewilderment. He leaned in, his gaze tracing the lines and annotations with a fluency that stole my breath. "Ah," he said, the single syllable a world of understanding. His finger, calloused and sure, tapped the center of the diagram. The ghost hunter, the one who lives in the thin air. He saw past the chemistry, past the Latin name I'd scribbled in the margin. He saw the essence in his eyes. I wasn't a dying man on a quixotic mission or a disgraced academic chasing a phantom. I was a peer, a fellow cartographer of the impossible. He told me of a man, a specialty grower, who operated from the cloud-shrouded peaks of a remote, unnamed province. This man, whom Mr. Way referred to only as Lin, did not sell to florists or hobbyists. He cultivated a handful of specimens for a clientele that did not exist on any public registry. Practitioners of the old ways, collectors of the sublime, and, I suspected, individuals like me, who sought not beauty but function, a key to a locked door. This orchid, this Cattleya *''s brutal cousin, was one of Lin's specialties. It was not meant for pretty vases. It was a component, an ingredient. "He is a difficult man," Mr. Way said, pouring a cup of pale, steaming tea for me. "He trusts no one. He believes the modern world is a plague of noise, drowning out the whispers of the earth." He pushed the cup across the counter. "But he answers to me, sometimes." He saw his own lifetime of knowledge, the intricate wisdom passed down through generations, being dismissed as superstition by men in white coats with reductive minds. My quest, my reverence for a flower that existed at the edge of science, resonated with his own silent war. He asked for no payment, he demanded no explanation for why a man who looked like a strong wind could shatter him was seeking a flower that grew where the air was thin enough to kill. He simply nodded, a decision made in the deep, quiet places of his soul. He became my silent, indispensable ally, my bridge from the digital shadows of my apartment to the tangible, root-tanned soil reality I needed. A week later, I returned. The bell above his door chimed my arrival. Mr. Way looked up from grinding a deep purple root with a mortar and pestle. Without a word, he reached beneath the counter and produced a small, unmarked cardboard box. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, living thing trapped in its bony cage. This was it. Not a data point, not an email. A piece of the miracle. I took the box home as if carrying a holy relic. In the sterile silence of my apartment, the hum of the server in the closet seemed to hold its breath. I placed the box on my desk, my hands, once so weak, now steady with a terrifying, focused energy. I slit the tape with a letter opener. Inside, nestled in a bed of moist, dark sphagnum moss, was not a flower, but a single, pale green pseudobulb, no larger than my thumb, with a few fine, silvery roots clinging to it. It looked impossibly fragile. Taped to the inside of the lid was a small slip of rice paper, covered in Mr. Way's elegant script. It wasn't instructions. It was a poem. *The stone does not speak of the wind's persistence. It required an environment that echoed the specific, relentless pressures of its home. Not just the thin air, but the struggle, the scarcity, the very fact of its improbable existence. I looked from the cryptic poem to the dormant bulb, then to the glowing schematics of my hydroponic system on the monitor. I had been an architect, an engineer of a vessel, but Mr. Wei and the ghost of Lin were telling me I had to become something else. I had to become the canyon, the mountain, the persistent, shaping force. The war was no longer just about finding the pieces, it was about learning the language of the miracle itself. And my first word was lying in a bed of moss before me, silent, demanding, and alive. The sterile, chemical smell of my apartment was slowly being replaced by something else, something organic and sharp. It was the smell of the moss in the orchid's box, of the crushed herbs steeping in precise ethanol solutions, of my own body purging itself of poison. My desk, once a monument to architectural precision, was now a hybrid altar and laboratory. On one side, beakers and digital scales gleamed under the adjustable lamp. On the other, the box from Mr. Wei sat like a sacred reliquary, its silent, pale green occupant my new obsession. My hands, which had trembled lifting a teacup a month ago, were now steady as a surgeon's as I filtered a tincture. The regimen was a brutal, secret dance with time. I would spend days in the chemo ward, feeling the synthetic fire scour my veins, a necessary evil to maintain the facade. Then, in the privacy of my sickness, I would administer my own older cure. The extract was a paradoxy tasted of deep, loamy earth and a clean, metallic frost, a flavor that felt ancient. It didn't fight the chemo, it seemed to work around it, repairing what the poison damaged, bolstering what it sought to destroy. Within 3 weeks, the change was undeniable. The crushing fatigue began to lift, not in a wave, but in a slow, receding tide. The constant gnawing nausea subsided, replaced by a cautious, genuine hunger. My oncologist, Dr. Evans, a man who wore his skepticism like a white coat, called me in after a routine blood draw. He stared at the printout, his brow furrowed. "Alina, these numbers, they're remarkable. The tumor markers are down significantly. This is a 1 in 1,000 response to the chemo." He looked at me, his eyes searching for an explanation, a new diet, a miracle supplement, a secret prayer. I just smiled meekly and nodded, letting him believe his science was the sole reason. The lie was a shield, and behind it, I felt a terrifying, exhilarating power. I was no longer just a patient, I was a co-conspirator in my own survival. But survival was only the first piece. The real challenge was learning the language of the miracle itself. And my first word was lying in a bed of moss before me, silent, demanding, and alive. Every day, I would sit before the box and read Mr. Wei's poem. Asterisk the stone does not speak of the wind's persistence, yet the canyon is its testimony. Asterisk I had been the stone for so long, hardened by loss and illness. Now I had to become the wind. The schematics for the hydroponic system, once my pride, now seemed laughably crude. They were about providing everything in abundance: light, water, nutrients, a paradise. But the ghost orchid didn't come from paradise, it came from a struggle. I began to deconstruct my own creation. I reprogrammed the climate controls to introduce a daily, punishing cycle. The temperature would plummet at night, mimicking the thin, cold air of its high-altitude home. The humidity would spike for precisely 2 hours at dawn, a simulated mountain mist, before being pulled away by dehumidifiers I'd jury-rigged to create a dry, stressful afternoon. I replaced the rich nutrient solution with a diluted, almost barren one. Scarcity, not plenty. The pseudobulb did nothing. It just sat there, pale and inert in its bed of moss. I found myself talking to it, my voice a low whisper in the hum of the servers and the gentle hiss of the misters. "I know," I would say, "it's not what you're used to, but it's what you need. I was trying to persuade the stone to become a canyon. Weeks bled into a month. My strength returned, a solid, reliable thing. I could walk to the market without needing to stop and catch my breath. The hollows in my cheeks filled out. I looked for all the world like a woman in remission. A miracle. But my real miracle was stubbornly dormant. Doubt began to creep in, a familiar, cold tendril. Had I misinterpreted everything? Was the bulb already dead when it arrived? A final, cruel joke from a forgotten god. One evening, after a particularly draining chemo session, I sat before the box, feeling the old fatigue threatening to return. The lie to Dr. Evans felt heavy that day. I looked at the pseudobulb, this tiny, alien thing that held the key to everything, and I felt a surge of frustration. "This is the mountain's resistance," I whispered, my voice raw, "and I am the water, and I will carve my history." It was listening. The stone had heard the wind. And in the sterile silence of my apartment, the canyon had begun to form. The world, in its infinite irony, had handed me the perfect camouflage. My son and daughter-in-law saw my improved health, not as a miracle, but as a convenience they had to drive me to chemo less often. Isabella, hearing the good news, was relieved, as if she had dodged a social bullet. During a family dinner, she casually mentioned my recovery to a friend on the phone. "Yeah, Abuela's doing better. The doctors are amazing." I watched her from the dining table, her back turned. When I later mentioned I was taking some special herbal teas from my homeland, she rolled her eyes. "Abuela, please don't start with that witch doctor stuff. Just listen to the real doctors." Their arrogance was my shield. They were so blinded by prejudice, they couldn't see the truth before them. They saw a stubborn old woman clinging to superstition. They did not see the keeper of a silent covenant. They did not see the cartographer of a canyon being born in the second bedroom. Every moment I stole away from them was a treasure. While they thought I was napping, I was in my room, my sanctuary, my hands hovering over the wooden box. The faint thrum I had felt was no longer a one-time event. It had become a constant, a low-grade hum in the periphery of my senses. Like the sound of a distant waterfall, you only notice when you truly listen. The pseudobulb remained unchanged to the naked Aja, pale, wrinkled fist of potential. But to my newfound sensitivity, it was a dynamo of quiet activity. I found I didn't need to touch it anymore. Just sitting nearby, focusing my will, my Historia was enough. I would whisper to it of deep, dark earth and the patient pressure of time. I would tell it of the first drop of rain that begins the erosion of a continent. My chemo sessions became a strange sort of pilgrimage. The poison they pumped into my veins was no longer just an enemy, it was a whetstone. It sharpened my resolve, made the contrast between their sterile, chemical reality and my living, breathing truth all the more potent. Dr. Evans would smile, review my charts, and talk about favorable markers and encouraging resilience. He saw a body fighting. He had no idea the battle was being directed from a realm he would dismiss as folklore. I would sit in the vinyl chair, the cold IV line in my arm, and I would close my eyes, retreating inward. I imagined the chemo drugs not as healers, but as a harsh, scouring wind, and my body as the mountain, enduring, being shaped. The nausea was the grind of stone on stone. The fatigue was the deep, settling peace of the land after a storm. One Tuesday, my son Marco drove me home. He was in a good mood, humming along to the radio. "See, Ma," he said, pulling up to my apartment building. "Just stick to the plan, no more of that jungle tea, okay? We have you on the right track." I walked straight to the room, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. I knelt before the box, my breath held, and I saw it. A crack. Not a flaw, not a sign of decay, but a deliberate, purposeful fissure in the very top of the pseudobulb. It was hair-thin, a tiny, dark line against the pale green. From it emerged a nub, no larger than a pinhead, a vibrant, impossible emerald green. It wasn't a leaf, not yet. It was a promise. It was the first word of a story the world had forgotten how to read. A sob caught in my throat, not of sadness, but of a profound, terrifying joy. This was it. The stone was not just listening, it was answering. The canyon walls were beginning to shear. I reached out a trembling finger, but stopped an inch away. I would not touch it. This was too sacred. That night, the dream was different. I was no longer standing at the edge of the chasm. I was in it. The air was cool and moist, smelling of wet stone and something else. Something sweet and floral I couldn't name. The light was a soft, diffused green, filtering down from an impossibly high opening. I could hear the quiet, steady drip, drip, drip of water, the patient sculptor. And then I saw them. Not just the ghostly impressions of my ancestors, but their faces, clear and serene, looking down at me from the ledges and crevices. They were not smiling, but their gaze was one of acknowledgement, of approval. My grandmother nodded slowly, and in that nod was the weight of generations. I woke with a start, the first rays of dawn, painting my room in shades of gray and gold. The resonance from the box was stronger now, a palpable energy that seemed to thicken the air around it. The tendril of doubt that had once been my constant companion was gone, replaced by the unshakable bedrock of knowing. They thought my strength was a sign of their medicine working. They thought my quiet determination was the acceptance of an old woman. They had no idea that the real medicine was quietly cracking open its shell in a locked room, and that my acceptance was that of a river that has finally found its course, ready to wear down any mountain that stands in its way. The miracle wasn't my remission. The miracle was growing, one silent, green moment at a time. The trap was my own body. At my next oncology appointment, the scans showed something impossible. The largest tumor had shrunk by 60%. My doctor was ecstatic and bewildered, talking about spontaneous remissions and writing a paper on my case. He used words like anomaly and miracle, his eyes bright with the scientific fervor that completely missed the truth. He saw a medical mystery. I saw a sign. The stone's resonance was not just a feeling in my bones. It was a physical, measurable force, carving out the sickness from the inside, replacing it with something ancient and patient. I knew then it was time. The path was clear, as if laid out for me in the green, dripping dreamlight of the chasm. I called my son, my voice intentionally frail and weak, a perfect imitation of the woman they all expected me to be. I told him the doctor's news was good, a blessing, but I was still so tired. The fight had taken so much out of me. I said I needed to have a serious family meeting to discuss my estate and final wishes. To make sure everything was in order before my strength failed completely, I insisted Isabella be there. The mention of money and inheritance, that crude and universal key, ensured they would all attend. Their faces arranged in masks of solemn concern. They arrived on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of bright, cheerful day that felt like an insult to the gravity they presumed was in the air. I watched them from the window, Carlos with his shoulders already set in a posture of weary responsibility, his wife Susan clutching a casserole dish like a shield, and Isabella, my granddaughter, her face a perfect, placid lake of sympathy. I knew the currents that ran beneath it. I had seen the flicker in her eyes years ago when Carlos's father had left me his mother's antique ring. She was a collector of things, Isabella, and she saw me as the final, dwindling prize in her collection. I played my part perfectly. I let my hand tremble as I poured the tea. I accepted the casserole with a voice thin as parchment. I sat in my worn armchair, a shawl around my shoulders, the very picture of dignified surrender. The box, of course, was not in the room. It was upstairs, locked away, but I could feel its low hum through the floorboards, a secret chord that only I could hear. It was my bedrock, and it allowed me to perform this exquisite fragility without a single crack in my resolve. "Mother, we're just so relieved," Michael began, his voice too loud for the quiet room. "The doctor said it's remarkable, but the body is a strange vessel. Michael Ed holds on to trauma. The fear, it has a weight of its own. I need to lay things down. I need to be light." I gave Sarah my jewelry, all of it, save for the one ring I wore on my finger. I saw Isabella's eyes track it, a subtle, calculating flicker. I was dismantling my life before their eyes, brick by brick, and they were so busy watching the bricks, they never saw the foundation I was building beneath them. Then I turned to Isabella. "For you, Isabella," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength, just enough to be noticeable. "I have something different." Michael looked confused. Sarah's smile was fixed, but her eyes were sharp. "It's not of material value," I continued, holding her gaze. "But it has value to me. It's a geological specimen, a stone my grandfather found in the Canyonlands. He believed it had certain properties. Healing properties." I allowed a frail, slightly mystical smile to touch my lips. "I've kept it with me through all of this, a silly old woman's talisman, but I'd like you to have it. To remember me by. And to keep you safe." I looked only at Isabella. "It's in a wooden box in my bedroom. I'll show you before you leave. It's important that you're the one who takes it, that you understand its significance." "I would be honored, Eleanor. Truly, I'll cherish it." The moment her fingers brushed the old wood, I felt it a shift in the resonance, a subtle recoil, like a root touching something poisonous. She felt nothing, of course. She only saw a box. "Thank you, Eleanor," she whispered, clutching it to her chest as if it were a newborn. I feel something already." She was the riverbank now, and the stone's power was the current. It would not heal her vanity, it would erode it, it would not grant her wishes. It would whisper her deepest fears back to her in the dead of night. It would not make her important. It would show her, in the unflinching gaze of the canyon, how infinitesimally small she was. The trap was no longer just my body. It was the stone itself, and I had just placed it gently, lovingly, into the hands of my enemy. The mountain was already beginning to crumble. They gathered in my son's living room, the place where I had been made to feel like a relic. Carlos and Susan sat opposite me, holding hands, their expressions a perfect blend of sympathy and impatience. Isabella slumped in an armchair, texting furiously, annoyed at having her weekend interrupted. My son cleared his throat and began, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "Mom, we're so glad you're doing better, but we need to be realistic. We've found a wonderful assisted living facility for when the time comes." They spoke of my life as if it were already over, a series of logistical problems to be managed. But I was no longer inside it. I was the one holding the key, watching from the outside as they busily decorated the walls. "It's called Silver Birch Haven," Susan chirped, leaning forward as if sharing a delicious secret. "They have bingo nights, and the meals are all nutritious. You'll have so much more independence there. We just want what's best for you, Mom," he said, the phrase so polished from overuse it had lost all meaning. My gaze drifted to Isabella. She wasn't even pretending to listen. The glow of her phone screen illuminated a face of profound boredom, her thumbs a frantic blur. She was thinking of her friends, of some party or drama that was infinitely more important than the dismantling of her grandmother's life. She was so young, so sure of her own centrality in the universe. She had no idea that a quiet, geological pressure had already begun to build deep within her. A tectonic shift initiated the moment her greedy fingers had brushed that old, locked box. "Isabella," I said, my voice cutting through Susan's prattle about physical therapy amenities. "What do you think? I need my beauty sleep." The administrator, a lovely woman named Brenda, said she'd block out the whole afternoon for us. It had taught me that some landscapes are not meant to be lived in. They are meant to be endured, and in that endurance a terrible granite strength is forged. Isabella finally put her phone down, a dramatic sigh escaping her lips. "Are we almost done?" I told Megan I'd meet her. I saw the faint purple smudges under Isabella's eyes, the ones her concealer couldn't quite hide. A bad dream, perhaps? The first faint whisper from the box on her dresser. She thought it was just stress. She hadn't yet learned to recognize the specific chill of the canyon's breath on the back of her neck. They stood up, the meeting adjourned. Carlos came over and gave me a hug. It was the same brief, brittle embrace he'd given me at the hospital, all function and no feeling. Susan's was a perfumed pat on the back. But Isabella, when she slouched past, I reached out and took her wrist. My grip was light, but she stopped, surprised. "How are you sleeping, my dear?" I asked, my voice low, a flicker of something irritation, and beneath it, a sliver of unease crossed her face. "Fine. Why?" "It takes time to adjust." They walked out into the bland suburban afternoon, utterly unaware that the mountain was crumbling, and that I had just handed the most treacherous piece of it to the one who deserved to feel the landslide most of all. The trap was sprung. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a peace that was as deep and as cold as stone. The silence that followed my question was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, thick and heavy, pressing in on all of us. I watched the words land on Isabella, each one a tiny, sharp stone. Her face, a moment ago a smooth canvas of bored indifference, now twitched with the effort of processing the direct hit. The mask of confusion was real, but it was a superficial reaction, like a pond's surface rippling while something monstrous stirred in the depths below. "Mom, what are you?" Carlos's voice was a strained whisper, a plea from a man who had built his life on the foundation of pleasant, manageable fictions. I held up a hand, and the authority in the gesture, honed over decades of commanding far more difficult rooms than this, silenced him completely. His mouth closed with a soft click. Susan, perched on the edge of the floral armchair, looked as if she'd been flash-frozen, her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly a gash of color in a bloodless face. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been atomized and reassembled with me at its absolute center. Isabella's eyes, wide and suddenly too bright, darted from her father's stunned face to her mother's horrified one, searching for a script, a cue, anything to tell her how to react to this unprecedented breach of protocol. Finding nothing, her gaze finally settled on me. The initial confusion hardened into a defensive, adolescent glare. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too sharp. "I was never ashamed of you." She remembered, of course she remembered. The cruelty of the young is rarely premeditated. It is a casual, reflexive thing, which makes it all the more cutting. She had been performing for the boy, constructing a version of herself that was unburdened by something as mundane as a grandmother. That was different," she stammered, the glare replaced by a flicker of genuine shame. It was crowded. "I didn't see you. I am simply stating a fact. We are a family built on unstated resentments and carefully managed politeness. I find I am tired of it. If we are to proceed with this transaction, then let there be a moment of truth at its inception. It's care that disregard for the past can poison the present. That's some things," I said, leaning forward slightly, forcing her to feel the weight of my gaze, "are not just boxers." "I don't want your stupid box," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears of anger and humiliation. "It's too late for that," I said, settling back into my chair. The brief surge of energy was receding, leaving the deep, cold peace in its wake. "It is yours. The decision has been made. You will take it to your clean, new room in your clean, new house. And you will learn what it means to be tied to something older and far less forgiving than your fleeting social anxieties." It had tasted her casual disregard in this room, and it would now feast on the fear and uncertainty that was blooming within her. Carlos looked from his daughter's stricken face to my implacable one. The battle was over, and he knew it. He had come here to manage an elderly parent, to execute a plan. He had not come to wage a spiritual war, and he was hopelessly outmatched. "Let's go," he said, his voice hollow. He took Susan's elbow, guiding her toward the door. She went numbly, throwing one last, bewildered look over her shoulder. Isabella didn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as a grandmother, not as an inconvenience, but as a force of nature, a dangerous one. "It's just a box," she repeated, but the words were a feeble incantation now, a desperate attempt to rebuild the reality my words had shattered. I gave her a slow, deliberate smile. It held no warmth. Then you have nothing to worry about, my dear. I closed my eyes, and in the quiet of the settling house, I could almost hear the faint, whispering echo from the lacquered box. A sound like wind through a deep, dark canyon, calling out to its new home. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was thick, charged, a held breath waiting for release. I placed the folder on the coffee table, the crisp manila a stark contrast to the worn, floral pattern. These are my latest medical reports, I stated, my voice flat, devoid of the tremor they expected. The ones my oncologist is calling a medical miracle. He can't explain it, but I can. I then pulled out my old leather journal. The cover was scarred, the edges softened by decades of handling. It smelled of dried herbs, of old paper, of time itself. I opened it, the binding cracking like a tiny gunshot in the tense quiet. Carlos shifted, his earlier impatience curdling into a different kind of discomfort. Susan was still clutching her purse, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the folder as if it were a venomous snake. But Isabella's eyes were narrowed, her chin lifted in that defiant, beautiful arc that was both her greatest strength and her most profound weakness. She was still armored in her skepticism, but the first hairline fractures were there, around the edges. I then pulled out my old leather journal. The cover was scarred, the edges softened by decades of handling. It smelled of dried herbs, of old paper, of time itself. I opened it, the binding cracking like a tiny gunshot in the tense quiet. I began to speak, not as abuela, not as the fading matriarch they had come to manage, but as Dr. Alina Morales. I was 28 when I first isolated the compound, I began, my fingers tracing a complex chemical diagram I'd inked 50 years ago. It was in a specimen of asterisk, Sanguinaria tellurus, asterisk bloodroot of the earth. A folk name for a plant that doesn't exist in any modern botanical guide. My colleagues at the university called it a contaminant, a fantasy. They laughed when I presented my initial findings on its effect on aberrant cell lines. Susan's mouth was slightly agape, the script of difficult elderly parent utterly useless now. I didn't just brew herbal teas, Isabella, I said, my eyes locking with hers. I engineered precise tinctures. The bitter taste you always complained about as a child was a calculated balance of alkaloids and enzymatic catalysts. The weird smell in my kitchen was the vapor of a decoction stabilizing at precisely 98.7 degrees Celsius. It was never magic. It was biochemistry. Advanced, unorthodox, but science nonetheless. The mountain wasn't just my home, I continued, my voice dropping, becoming more intimate, more dangerous. It was my laboratory. The canyon wasn't a place for picnics. It was the source of my most potent reagents. Its energy, as you so dismissively called it, Carlos, is a measurable, if poorly understood, psionic field of resonance that amplifies intentionality. My work required that resonance. It required the patience of the stone and the hunger of the deep earth. Susan finally found her voice, a thin, reedy thing. But the doctors, the scans, they said it was terminal. Stage 4. The sound seemed to snap Isabella out of her trance. This is insane, she whispered, but the conviction was gone from her words. They were a plea, not a statement. You're talking about what geomancy, alchemy. A survival that required a specific catalyst to complete the final synthesis. I let my gaze drift meaningfully toward the foyer, where she had fled with the lacquered box. A catalyst you so kindly provided, but the box is the hand that turns the key. It contains a focused resonance, a sliver of the canyon's core. For decades, I have been building the fortress within my own body. The box provides the final, permanent garrison. The hurt, pride, and dawning terror I had seen in her as she fled had now blossomed into full-blown, gut-wrenching horror. You used me, she breathed, her voice trembling. You used all of us. This whole performance, you wanted us to think you were crazy. You wanted me to tick that box. It requires a grounding rod, a new anchor in the world to stabilize the transformation within me. Your casual disregard in this room, your certainty that you knew better. It made you the perfect candidate. The energy loves a challenge. It loves to prove the arrogant wrong. You were correct about one thing. An ending was here. But it is not mine. And you will finally understand the price of the miracle you helped enact. I turned back to them. My family, my unwitting instruments. The mountain is no longer crumbling. It is awakening, and you have just carried its heart into the world. The letter lay between us on the polished wood, a simple piece of paper that had just detonated their entire reality. My son Robert was the first to crack, his eyes, wide with the shock of the number, flickered from the letter to my face, then to the mountain looming beyond the window. I could see the frantic calculations behind his gaze, the desperate attempt to reconcile the frail, dying woman he thought he'd come to manage with the architect of this corporate coup. His voice, when it came, was a strained, hollow thing, a buyout mother. What is this? What have you done? She was not looking at the letter. She was staring through it, her gaze turned inward, listening. The whisper from the box was no longer a faint, psychic static. It was a low, resonant hum, a frequency tuning itself to the very marrow of her bones. She could feel it now, the weight I had spoken of, a density gathering in her core. You said, a grounding rod, she whispered, her voice trembling with the effort to form words. You said it was volatile. This letter, this isn't about the money. It's a receipt, proof of the miracle. Her eyes snapped to mine, bright with a terror so profound it was almost awe. They're not paying for the research. They're paying for the result. For you, the energy I channeled to rewrite my own cellular decay is not a static formula. It is a living process. My journal doesn't contain a recipe. It contains a map of the transformation. A map they now desperately want to follow. But the map is useless without the key. And the key, I said, letting my gaze drift meaningfully toward, the leather bag still clutched in her white-knuckled hand, is no longer solely in my possession. Stop talking in riddles. You sold some herbal cure to a pharmaceutical company. Do you have any idea the liability, the scrutiny? We need lawyers. We need to manage this. The last sliver of sun was vanishing behind the mountain's peak. But the mountain itself seemed to be holding the light, emitting a faint ethereal glow from within its ancient rock, but not from the FDA. Look, in their place was a profound, waiting silence, as if the entire range was holding its breath. The mountain is no longer crumbling because it is whole, I explained, my reflection a stark, powerful outline against the darkening, glowing glass. The illness you perceived was its labor. For decades, it gathered its strength, its consciousness, funneling it through the geological fault lines that converged beneath this very house. I was merely the first vessel able to contain a fraction of that power. I was the catalyst. But a catalyst is consumed in the reaction, Robert less. The reaction is transferred. The energy I unleashed needed a new home in the world. A stable point to prevent it from consuming me entirely as it completed its work. Your pride, your certainty that you were saving a senile old woman from her own foolishness. It made you the perfect conduit. You didn't just take a box, Isabella. You accepted a covenant. The air in the room grew thick, charged with an ozone temps. The company's offer is not a business transaction. It is a tribute. They have seen the data, the impossible remission, the cellular regeneration. They believe they can replicate it, bottle it, sell it. They are fools playing with a fire they cannot comprehend. But their resources, their global reach, they will be useful. They will become the vehicle through which the mountain's awakening touches the world. A world sick and dying, desperate for a miracle. You are no longer just my granddaughter. You are the keeper, the guardian of the heart you so willingly carried away, and your life, your very comfortable, predictable life, is over. They were my first disciples, and their baptism was one of terror and awe. The game was over. The world was ours. Justice was not a confrontation. It was a quiet closing of a door. They tried to apologize, of course shocked, fumbling, desperate pleas for forgiveness, but I felt nothing. Their apologies were not for their cruelty, but for their catastrophic miscalculation. I saw them for what they were. Small, hollow people, blinded by a superficial shame they had mistaken for ambition. I informed them I would be moving out, that the funds would be placed in a trust for my research, and that they were no longer part of my life. Their punishment was to be left with the crushing knowledge of what they had thrown away, not just the money, but the person I was. The heritage they had despised, which held the key to my survival. I left them standing there in their sterile, minimalist living room, a space that had always felt more like a hotel suite than a home. The silence I left in my wake was heavier, more profound than any slammed door. I didn't look back. There was nothing for me there. My path was now lit by a different kind of fire, the cold, clear luminescence of the mountain's heart. My new apartment was a small, sunlit space on the top floor of an old brownstone, its windows facing the distant, hazy line of the mountains. It was the first place that had ever felt like mine. The funds from the company, a staggering sum that had been wired into the trust with terrifying efficiency, were not for my comfort. They were a tool, a resource for the work to come. I felt a flicker of grim satisfaction, knowing that the very corporate machinery my parents had worshipped was now financing its own undoing. Or, more accurately, its subjugation. The first few days were a study in surreal tranquility. I unpacked the few boxes I had brought from my grandmother's cabin, her journals, a quilt she had stitched, the strange, smooth river stone she kept on her nightstand. These items didn't just hold memories. They hummed with a familiar energy, a low thrum that resonated with the new current in my own blood. I could feel it now, a constant, quiet vibration just beneath my skin, a second pulse that synced with my heartbeat. It was the energy my grandmother had woven into me. I was the keeper. Whether I understood what that meant or not, the peace was shattered by a phone call. It wasn't my parents. It was a Dr. Aris Thorne, the head of the company's newly formed Anomalous Biological Studies division. His voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. He didn't ask how I was. He stated that my preliminary blood work, taken during the initial assessment, showed fascinating telomeric anomalies and protein markers never before documented. He requested, with the polite insistence of someone who has never been denied, a more comprehensive series of tests. A cold dread, the kind my grandmother had prophesied, coiled in my stomach. I was no longer a person, I was a specimen. I declined, my voice surprisingly steady. The silence on the other end of the line was heavier than my parents had been. It was the silence of a predator, recalculating its approach. "This is a monumental opportunity for science, Ms. Rossi," he said, his tone frosting over. "For all of humanity. I strongly urge you to reconsider." The threat was implicit. They would not simply let their most valuable asset walk away. That evening, as I traced the patterns on my grandmother's quilt, I felt a sudden, sharp pull, a psychic hook sinking into the core of that new energy inside me. It was a summons. I closed my eyes and let myself follow it. In my mind's eye, I was no longer in the apartment. I stood in the clearing before my grandmother's cabin. She was there, but not as the warden or the high priestess. She was a silhouette of pure, crackling power, the air around her shimmering like a heat haze. Asterisk, they have made contact. Asterisk, her voice echoed in my skull, not as sound, but as pure meaning. Asterisk, the first tendrils. They are clumsy, all brute force and curiosity. You feel their pull. The mountain's heart is not just a battery to be measured. It is a will. Make it your armor. Asterisk. But I was different. My grandmother's design was not just about revealing a terrible truth. It was about forcing evolution. She had thrown me into the deep end, knowing the water was full of sharks, because that was the only way I would learn to become something more than prey. I walked to the window, looking out at the city lights glittering like a false constellation. My comfortable, predictable life was indeed over. But in its place was something terrifying and vast. I was the keeper, and my first act would not be to hide, but to understand the full extent of the power I now guarded. The company believed they were studying a new resource. They were wrong. They were poking a sleeping giant with a stick, and I was the giant's newly awakened and very attentive eyes. The sterile, clean scent of nutrient gel and the gentle rustle of leaves are the incense in my new cathedral. My epilogue is written in the quiet hum of my new laboratory, a symphony of purpose I conduct. Mr. Wei, my chief horticulturalist, moves between the hydroponic arrays with a reverence I once reserved for peer-reviewed journals. We are two old souls from different worlds, our common language found in the delicate unfurling of a new leaf and the complex chemical signatures we analyze together. He never asks about my past, the tremor that used to plague my hands, or the haunted look I know was in my eyes. He simply sees Dr. Morales, and in his quiet respect, I have learned to see her again. I am no longer a ghost. The spectral figure that haunted the halls of Innovetic, ignored and dismissed, has been given solid, breathing form. I lead a small, hand-picked team of bright, young scientists. They are untainted by corporate avarice, their eyes alight with genuine curiosity. When I speak, they listen, not with the barely veiled disdain of my former colleagues, but with a hunger to understand. Their respect was not a title I was given. It is something I built with them, day by day, in this sanctuary of growth. My health is restored. The persistent fatigue, the nerve pain that felt like a constant internal scrimmy, it's all gone. But the healing was more than physical. My spirit, once fractured and cowering, is now whole. I found my cure not just in the heart of a rare orchid. The Cattleya luciana whose bioluminescent properties we are now carefully cultivating. But in the reclaiming of my own dignity. Each successful experiment, each breakthrough documented in our own private servers, felt like laying another brick in the foundation of my new self. My revenge wasn't a fiery act of destruction. I didn't leak their data to the press or sabotage their projects. To do so would have meant playing on their board by their rules. I chose a different path. My revenge was an act of creation. I didn't destroy their world. I simply built a new one without them in it. This world is housed in a repurposed textile mill on the outskirts of a small college town. The light that streams through the large arched windows is real, filtered through the leaves of the plants we study. It is a world funded by a discreet and surprisingly substantial grant from a foundation with no ties to any major corporation. A foundation whose benefactor, an elderly woman with impossibly sharp eyes, insisted on absolute anonymity. Sometimes I feel a flicker of that same ancient, knowing presence in the still air of the lab, a silent approval. And in this new world, I am finally, peacefully, healed. Or so I tell myself, and in this new world, I am finally, peacefully, healed. Yet the peace is profound because it is earned, a discipline maintained through vigilance and purpose. The peace is profound, but it is also a practice, a discipline. Some nights, when the moon is high and the lab is empty, the memory of the mountain's heart is a phantom pulse in my veins. I can still feel the thrum of that immense, sleeping will. The lattice of energy I learned to weave around myself as my grandmother's voice echoed in my mind. The pull from Innovatech is gone, yes, muted to a distant, muffled irritation I can easily ignore, but the awareness remains. I am the keeper. The title is not a honorific. It is a function of my being, as intrinsic as my own heartbeat. I sometimes catch myself looking at the intricate root structures of the Cattleya luciana seeing not just a plant, but a network, a living lattice not unlike the shield I once formed. I understand now that my grandmother's design was not merely about revealing a terrible truth or forcing a single evolution. It was about alignment. My work here, this act of creation, is part of it. It is a different expression of the same principle. Nurturing life, understanding its deep, resonant language, and protecting its fragile, brilliant light. The company, in their arrogance, still believes they are studying a new resource, a battery, to be measured and drained. They are still poking the sleeping giant with their sticks. Their sensors blindly probing the edges of a consciousness they cannot comprehend. I am no longer just the giant's newly awakened eyes. I have become its hands, too. While they look for a power source to exploit, I am here, quietly learning how to tend the garden in which it dreams. My peaceful epilogue is not an ending, it is a vigil, and I am contentedly its watchful keeper.